Hi everyone, my name is Damon Gameau and I am a film director and recently made the film 2040, and I am delighted to be able to read you and live out a play school fantasy with a little kelp from our friends, The Secret Life of Seaweed, a beautiful book by Mat Bate, with a foreword by yours truly. What if I told you that on our planet there exists an organism that is capable of restoring life in the ocean? An organism that contains essential vitamins and minerals and can provide seafood for billions of people. What if I told you this organism can absorb nutrients like nitrogen from ocean dead zones and be used as a material to make plastics and clothing? That can be made into food for cattle to reduce their methane emissions and into a biofuel for renewable energy. An organism that could potentially remove a huge amount of carbon from our atmosphere, then store it for centuries on the ocean floor, which would help us stop the impacts of global warming. If I told you this, I'd imagine you'd say, well, this sounds like some kind of miracle. And I'd say, nah, it's just seaweed. I spent the last 6 years of my life exploring how we can learn from nature to live more sustainably. In particular, I've focused on what would provide the greatest benefits to people and our environment. And seaweed gets the gold star by a long shot. And right now it is causing a stir amongst scientists and engineers around the world. Contained within the pages of this book is a beautiful love letter to seaweed. Seaweed is the quiet, humble, slightly shaggy person in the corner who at first you don't notice. But with each interaction, something new and exciting is revealed. And before you realise it, you're sending messages and the entanglement is complete. Seaweed is perhaps the most inappropriately named thing on the planet because it is so much more than a weed. Welcome to your new crush. Here's a bit of editing, but it was largely okay. In the beginning. The story of life on Earth starts in the water. Without our oceans, life as we know it would never exist. For the first billion years, there was almost no life on Earth. There were no trees, no birds, no insects, and no fish because there wasn't enough oxygen in the atmosphere. Then, 3.5 billion years ago, tiny creatures called cyanobacteria came along and everything changed. Did you know that almost 3/4 of the Earth's surface is water? And that our brain and heart are almost 3/4 water as well. So why did the cyanobacteria change our world? Well, these tiny sea creatures made oxygen for the Earth's atmosphere. And using light from the sun, they turned carbon dioxide and water into sugars, which they used as energy to grow. In the process, they breathed out the life support gas, oxygen, and we call this process photosynthesis. Over hundreds of millions of years, these simple organisms evolved into other life forms. Some of these were marine algae, which also lived in the oceans and produced oxygen. As more and more algae grew, enough oxygen was produced to support new life. In fact, all the animals and plants on Earth today evolved from these very early life forms. Now, cyanobacteria are so small that if you turn 25 million people into cyanobacteria, all the people in Australia, you could fit them into a tablespoon. Take a deep breath. Most of the oxygen in that breath comes from the land-based plants. But take another breath. The oxygen in every second breath comes from marine algae. Not only do they produce half of the world's oxygen, marine algae make up 4/5 of the organic living matter on Earth. So there's lots of them. Some algae are so small you need a microscope to see them. But other kinds of algae are very large. Now we're ready to meet the largest of all the marine algae. Can you guess what they're commonly known as? Seaweed. The colour of seaweed. There are around 10,000 different types of seaweed. 10,000. To tell them apart, you can group them into 3 main colours: green, brown, and red. The colour of the seaweed relates to the light it absorbs and reflects, and how deep it grows. Most seaweeds are found in less than 30 metres of water, where there's a lot of light. But the deeper you go underwater, the less light there is. Light travels in waves, and each wavelength of light has a colour. Different wavelengths of light penetrate further into water than others. Seaweed absorb some wavelengths of light and reflect the rest. The colour you see when you look at seaweed is actually the colour of the light being reflected. The record for the deepest seaweed is a red seaweed that was growing at 295 metres under the water. That's almost the length of 6 Olympic-sized swimming pools. Seaweeds that grow in shallow water absorb red light and reflect green light. These are the green seaweeds. Seaweeds that grow to around 30 metres underwater absorb blue and green light and reflect yellow and red light. These are the brown seaweeds. Blue wavelengths of light can travel much faster through the water than other wavelengths, such as red. Seaweeds that grow in deep water absorb blue light, some green light, and reflect red light. Wow. These are the red seaweeds.
Hi, I'm Arielle from Groundswell Giving, and I'm going to be reading to you from With a Little Kelp from Our Friends. This is called Women and the Sea. Historically, women from different cultures all around the world have made the beach and the ocean a second home, collecting seaweeds and shellfish to eat and sell. In the Jeju province of Korea, women collect seaweeds and other seafood by holding their breath and diving very deep, carrying just a knife and a long hook. They store their catch in a net bag that floats on the surface of the ocean. These women, known as henyo, are the main providers and the heads of their households. The henyo have passed down this tradition of freediving from mother to daughter for more than 300 years. Girls start training when they're as young as 8, and many henyo are still diving into their 80s. They can dive for up to 6 hours at a time, coming up quickly to offload their bounty before taking another deep breath and diving back down. For around 2,000 years, Japanese women called ama, or sea woman, have been freediving for seaweed, shellfish, and pearls. The ama can hold their breath for more than 3 minutes, and they used to wear nothing but a loincloth and a bandana to keep the hair out of their eyes. Many ama dive well into old age. In Zanzibar, Tanzania, almost all seaweed farmers are women. The seaweeds are grown in shallow water on a line tied between 2 sticks. As the oceans become warmer because of climate change, it's become harder to grow seaweeds close to the shore. Some seaweed farmers are now farming in cooler, deeper waters, using recycled fishing nets tied in a special tube. From the late 1800s through to the 1970s, the Cockle women of South Wales collected seaweed and shellfish. Most left home before sunrise and worked up to 10 hours a day, even in bad weather, foraging for laver and raking out cockles. It was backbreaking and dangerous work.
Hello, my name is Leesa Lambert from the Little Bookroom in Melbourne, the oldest children's bookshop in the world, and the best. I'm reading to you about growing up fast on land. The mountain ash is one of the largest trees in the world. It can grow as much as 2 metres a year and more than 100 metres in its lifetime. In the ocean, the largest seaweed is giant kelp. It can grow in just 2 days, 1 metre, and reach its full length of 50 metres in just a few months. Like big trees, seaweed such as kelp create large, dense forests that are filled with lots of different animals. Kelp forests grow in cool water. They once reached from Japan to Alaska, snaking down the coast of Canada and the US, all the way to South America. Parts of Europe, Africa, Australia, and New Zealand also had vast kelp forests. As temperatures rise with global warming, kelp suffers. Tasmania's giant kelp forests have almost entirely disappeared in the past few decades because of warming oceans. Did you know that there are 112 types of kelp? Ooh, the cycle of life. On Earth, there is a cycle of life called the food chain, where everything eats everything else. In the ocean, seaweeds, algae, Plankton and other tiny organisms are eaten by small animals like fish, crabs, and shrimps. These small animals are then eaten by larger animals, and the cycle continues all the way to the ocean's biggest predators: sharks, seals, and killer whales. When these predators die, they are eaten by scavengers and tiny animals like worms. Then the cycle of life begins again. Seaweeds are the foundation of life in the ocean. They provide food and shelter for lots of different creatures. Without seaweeds, the ocean would be very different. Thank you.
Hey, I'm Matt, the author of With a Little Kelp from Our Friends, and happy book week. I thought I would read a section of the book that's often missed because it's right at the back. But for me, it's one of the most important pages because it allows me to acknowledge some people and then provide a little author's note. So firstly, this book was written on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people and the Gunai-Kurnai people. I'd like to acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people for their essential connection to country and their long history of sustainable and regenerative fishing techniques. And now, my author's note. Our challenge now, as a global community, is how we can heal our home, the Earth. This challenge is not a burden. It's a perfect opportunity to reconnect with the environment around us and to learn from nature, a powerful teacher. This is what led me to seaweed. The potential in a clump of seaweed could change the world. It's not the sole solution to global warming, but it is an important piece in the climate puzzle. It's part of an approach that's grounded in connection, conservation, and regeneration, where we tread lightly, acknowledging the role we play in restoring balance. We're at a turning point, and what we do now will determine our future.